Welcome back to Reimagine Success, the podcast where we rethink what achievement really means in a world that glorifies overwork. I'm your host, Nabeela Elsayed. Today we're diving into the most common questions I hear. How do I know if I'm just exhausted or if I'm actually experiencing burnout? It's not always an easy distinction. Exhaustion is part of life, but burnout is something deeper, something that reshapes the way we think, feel, and show up in the world. In this episode, we'll look at the history of burnout, the 12 stages it often progresses through, and a new way to measure it with the burnout assessment tool. Most importantly, we'll break down the practical signs that help you know which one you're facing and what to do next. So if you've been wondering whether you just need more rest or if it's time for something bigger, this conversation is for you. Let's get started. This week, I began an engagement with a new client, a beautiful soul who had recently been through a difficult time. She had a significant caregiver role, had lost 2 loved ones in a short span of time, and was increasingly feeling burnt out at work. As we began our conversation, I asked her to describe how she was feeling. She spoke of a heavy fogginess, of never feeling like she could really rest, of her body beginning to send signals she didn't quite understand. At one point, I gently asked her, "Have you spoken to your doctor about these symptoms?" Her answer, "No. Should I? How do I know the difference between if I'm just tired or something more serious?" It's one of the most common and most important questions I hear when working with individuals who are experiencing burnout. And there are several reasons why people struggle to differentiate between normal exhaustion and something more serious. Number one is that exhaustion has become so normalized in our culture that it's considered par for the course with existence. So many people are living with such a high level of stress, exhaustion, loneliness, or overstimulation that they've lost a baseline comparison of what it feels like not to be hollowed out by it all. Secondly, there's the stigma, the heavy cloud that follows us around every time we allow ourselves to reach for help. That stigma fills our head with shame. That admitting we can't handle it all is the same as confessing failure. That reaching our limit somehow makes us weak, incapable, and less than. Inside our heads, the narrative plays on repeat. You should be stronger. What's wrong with you? Look around. Everyone else seems to be managing. Why can't you? That voice is a monster we've learned to live with, one that shames us into silence. And too often, it keeps us from recognizing the very moment when we most need help. And number 3, the medical framing of burnout and its definition has been something of a hot potato. For example, the World Health Organization added burnout to the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases, which was a breakthrough in recognizing the impact and cost of burnout. Still, the World Health Organization was very narrow in its definition of burnout, and it was very specific to mention that it is not classified as a medical condition. I've previously written about why this definition is flawed, and you can read more about it on a different post called Burnout, the Persistent Strain of Modern Work. Now, why would the World Health Organization take such a narrow approach? Well, I'm not an expert in healthcare policy, so I'll leave you with a perspective from a medical doctor who gave me the best understanding as to why the WHO took the approach they did. They told me that burnout is so pervasive that if the WHO had identified it as a disease, then half the world would automatically get diagnosed with a clinical disease. And lastly, the final reason burnout can be challenging to identify is that few people wake up to feeling burnt out. It's not like a cold where one day you have it and the next day you don't. Burnout creeps in slowly, builds over an extended period of time, and takes time to recover from. Now, let's go through a brief history of burnout. Even though the definition and classification of burnout is still creating consternation in the medical community, the term burnout has been around for decades and was first identified in the 1970s by Dr. Herbert Freudenberger, a psychologist who observed troubling symptoms in healthcare workers and volunteers. They were physically depleted, emotionally detached, and increasingly cynical towards the people they served. Not long after, Christina Maslach and her colleagues developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is also known as the MBI, to measure burnout across 3 dimensions: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, which is a sense of detachment or cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment. The MBI became the seminal assessment for categorizing and identifying burnout. Initially applied to helping professions like healthcare and teaching, the concept soon expanded to include all forms of work. And then, as mentioned earlier, in 2019, the World Health Organization officially recognized burnout as an occupational phenomenon, defining it as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. However, several experts who work with burnout began to recognize the limitations of the MBI, and in 2020, a more modern definition of burnout emerged, known as the BAT-23 or BAT-12, the Burnout Assessment Tool. It was developed by Wilmer Schaffioli and colleagues as a modern alternative to the Maslach burnout inventory. And it has very quickly become a widely used tool, primarily because it has a broader application. Unlike earlier tools that focused mainly on exhaustion, the BAT measures 4 core dimensions: exhaustion, which is the feeling of being drained and depleted; mental distance, which is the growing detachment or cynicism towards work; emotional and cognitive impairment, which is the difficulty regulating emotions or concentration; and psychological distress, which are feelings of tension, anxiety, or overwhelm. The creators of the BAT tool also developed 2 types of assessments, one specific to work and one that is generalized, recognizing that burnout can evolve and exist outside of the workplace. What also makes the BAT unique and effective is that it also screens for related symptoms like psychosomatic complaints and depressed mood. The BAT matters because it reflects the evolving understanding of burnout as more than just being tired. It captures the ripple effects burnout has on how we think, feel, and function, not only at work but in life. So if you're unsure where you land, a validated tool like the BAT can provide clarity. But even without a formal assessment, tuning into the 4 dimensions above is a powerful way to self-check. If you're interested in completing the Burnout Assessment Tool, I've provided a free digital download which you can use to complete a self-assessment inventory based on the Burnout Assessment Tool. Once you've completed it, I highly encourage you to reflect on it and, if necessary, share it with your medical provider. Now that you have a tool and method to identify if you are burnt out or not, it's also necessary to know the stages of how burnout evolves over time. The 12 stages of burnout. Researchers have mapped burnout as a progression that unfolds in 12 stages. You may also come across a more consolidated version of these stages and examples of 5 or 6 stages. I like using the 12 stages of burnout because I feel the specificity makes it easier to identify with. All right, let's explore how these 12 stages unfold. The first stage is the compulsion to prove oneself. It's a drive to show your worth, often through overworking. Then you continue to work even harder, and that usually involves pushing beyond healthy limits. You start to then neglect your needs. That could look like skipping meals, skipping sleep, or social time. And then you start to avoid conflict. You start to be irritable and have a denial of problems. Then you move into revision of values, where work becomes the only priority and friends and hobbies fade into the distance. Stage 6 is denial of problems, blaming stress on others and seeing yourself as indispensable. And then you move into withdrawal, which is avoiding social contacts and feelings of alienation. Then there starts to become even more obvious behavioral changes, noticeable shifts in mood, energy, or coping. Stage 9 includes depersonalization, where life feels mechanical and relationships lose warmth. And stage 10 moves into inner emptiness, a sense of meaninglessness, sometimes filled with escapist behaviors. Stage 11 is depressive tendencies like hopelessness, lack of motivation and passion for life, physical fatigue, and an inability to continue day-to-day activities as you normally would. And the final stage of burnout, stage 12, is a risk of a complete mental, emotional, and physical breakdown that requires immediate medical intervention. You may not experience every stage in a straight line, but chances are you recognize yourself somewhere along the path. Understanding the stages is key because these stages often get masked by other things in our life, and untreated may contribute to a very vast smorgasbord of other health conditions, including things like clinical depression, anxiety, forms of addiction, high blood pressure, and a weakened immune system. Burnout versus exhaustion, which brings us back to the original question. How do you know if you're just exhausted or if it's burnt out? Think of it like this. Exhaustion is like running out of gas. Once you refill the tank with sleep, rest, or a weekend away, you're good to go again. Burnout is like the engine itself starting to break down. Even if you fill the tank, the car won't run properly. And here are a few additional distinctions. Exhaustion is caused by short-term overexertion, usually relieved by adequate rest, sleep, or vacation. Energy returns once recovery happens and you still feel connected to purpose and meaning. Whereas burnout is caused by chronic, unmanaged stress, persists even after sleep or time off, is accompanied by cynicism, detachment, or loss of joy, and often comes with physical symptoms such as headaches, digestive issues, sleep problems, and emotional ones like numbness, irritability, and hopelessness. One simple reflection you should ask yourself: does rest restore me, or do I still feel flat, heavy, and disengaged afterwards? If rest helps, you're likely dealing with exhaustion. If rest doesn't move the needle, you may be facing burnout. What to do next? If you recognize yourself in exhaustion, prioritize real rest, quality sleep, time off, movement, and nourishing food. Pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Reclaim your attention and time and reinvest it in activities that bring you joy. Rebalance your labor load and ask for support from your leader, family, and friends. And don't just think about your paid labor, but think about your cognitive load, your emotional labor, and other parts of your life. Start rebalancing, resetting, and course correcting to treat exhaustion as a signal before it deepens. If you recognize yourself in burnout, then seek support. Complete the self-assessment and schedule an appointment to talk to your doctor, therapist, or a trusted coach. Reflect on alignment across the domains of your life. Are there large parts of your life that feel like they're out of alignment with your values? This could be at work, in relationships, or in your environment more broadly. What are the major stressors in your life, that big rocks that you carry that is causing the most considerable amount of stress and overwhelm? And you're going to need to consider structural changes. Burnout recovery often requires deep work and significant alterations in your life. Remember, a holiday or time off won't fix it. You will likely need a longer-term plan and approach. Some final thoughts. There's new research to suggest that up to 66% of Americans and 42% of Canadians are experiencing burnout. And those statistics are not surprising because we live in a society that seems designed to induce stress. Whether through the relentless pace of work, the responsibilities of parenting and caregiving without support, or the constant stream of troubling news on our phones. What's clearer than ever is that more and more people are living with varying levels of burnout and stress-related symptoms. That's why it's so important to learn how to tell the difference when stress is normal and can be relieved by rest and recovery, and when stress has crossed into dangerous territory that requires deeper intervention. As individuals, parents, teachers, leaders, and friends, the more equipped we are to recognize these signals, the better we can respond not only to protect our own well-being, but to support the people around us. And as a final note, I'm really excited to share something that I've been working on for months. A course that puts together every tool, tactic, and insight I've used throughout my executive coaching and my corporate career at a fraction of the cost. In addition, for the inaugural cohort, I'll be offering 3 60-minute live sessions as part of the course, something I may not repeat. This course is my way for making the transformation I see in private coaching accessible to more people. If you've been longing to break free from burnout, redefine success, and finally change your life for real, this course is for you. Spots will be limited to keep the experience meaningful, so if you're interested, you can follow the caption or the link below and join the wait list. All right, take care, everyone.